They didn't knock. They didn't even give a warning. The first thing I heard was Veronica from the HOA announcing, "We have strict aesthetic standards in this neighborhood and your place doesn't qualify." That old porch my grandfather built, the one that had stood solid for decades, suddenly felt like it had a target on it. Somehow, I was standing on my own family's land but being made to explain myself as if I were trespassing. The more I pushed back, the stranger everything became, a record shifting, property lines moving, neighbors looking at me differently. It stopped feeling like simple enforcement. It started to feel like a trap. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled up that October afternoon, breathing in sharp pine air after months of city chaos. Weeds had crept through the stone path, and the mountain wind carried the whistle of oncoming winter. My grandfather left me this cabin 2 years ago, and the work had kept me away. This time I intended to stay. But the moment I cut the engine, I saw them emerging from the tree linea like they'd been waiting, watching. Veronica Hale led the way, expression hard, clipboard gripped like a weapon. Her spotless hiking boots had never seen dirt. Behind her was Rick Porter, clutching a folder to his chest, glasses slipping as his hand shook. I was halfway to my door when Veronica's voice sliced through the mountain quiet, startling crows into flight. "Mr. Bennett, you are in violation of the Scenic Buffer Ordinance. If this isn't addressed immediately, it will escalate into proceedings that will cost you dearly." You'd think she was accusing me of a crime. All I had done was return home to property that had been in my family longer than she had been alive. Keys in hand, I kept walking, gripping the brass one my grandfather gave me as a boy. "I'm not sure what buffer you're referring to, Veronica," I said, "but this is my land. Maybe we can talk about this another time." She laughed, a sharp bark that rattled the branches. "Your property ends at the line. This cabin is an eyesore that breaks our standards. No structure can be visible from the road without approved screening or modifications." The lock clicked under my key, the same sound that had welcomed my family home for 60 years. She was lecturing me about ruining the view while I was unlocking the front door my grandfather had built with timber from these very woods. "This cabin's been here since 1962, I said, turning to face her. "That's about 40 years before your HOA even existed. Unless you've invented time travel, we don't have much to discuss." Her face flushed, but before she could reply, Rick spoke up in a shaky voice, fumbling with his papers. "Mr. Bennett, the situation is more complicated than you think. There are legal matters here that must be addressed." His hands trembled so badly, I wasn't sure if he believed what he was saying. That's when the sheriff's cruiser rolled up, dust curling in the sunlight like something out of an old western. Deputy Nate Ward stepped out, adjusting his belt with weary annoyance. I remembered his father fishing in our stream back when my grandfather was alive. "Afternoon, folks," he said, cutting Veronica off. "Got a call about a property dispute. Let's get this settled without trouble." Veronica lit up like she'd won. She gestured toward my cabin as if presenting damning evidence. "Perfect timing. Deputy, we need you to witness this violation and file a report against Mr. Bennett's non-compliant structure that's bringing down our community's value." Ward glanced at me, then at the weathered cabin of wood that had stood longer than most homes in the valley. Finally, he looked back at Veronica with tired eyes. "Ma'am, I checked the county records on my way here," he said, pulling out his phone. "This land belongs to Mr. Bennett, fair and clear. Transferred from his grandfather's estate 2 years ago." He held up the assessor's page with my name glowing on the screen. Rick made one last attempt, waving his papers like they could bulldoze my cabin into dust, his voice cracking as he spoke. Rick's voice cracked with desperation as he clutched the papers. "The scenic easement overrides any grandfathered structures under Statute 1749. We have authority to impose fines of up to $500 a day until you comply." Deputy Ward just shrugged, clearly uninterested in dragging this out further, and walked back to his cruiser. That left me standing there with 2 HOA representatives who looked furious but defeated. The silence that followed was perfecta, the kind where you can hear a single pine needle drop, broken only by the cry of a hawk circling overhead. They left soon after, muttering under their breath and casting dark looks back at me. Once they were gone, I decided to check the old barn about 200 feet from the cabin, hidden behind a patch of aspens. My grandfather had always used it to store his tractor and tools, and I wanted to see if the roof had survived another season. But the moment I reached the door, I knew something was wrong. The lock hanging there wasn't mine. It wasn't the rusty old master lock I'd left in July. This one was new, shiny, expensive-looking, etched with a serial number. My stomach sank. Someone had been inside. I pulled out my phone and started documenting everything of the fresh scratches around the hasp, the serial number engraved on the steel, RH237. I tried my key anyway, even though I knew it wouldn't work. The brass slid uselessly against the metal. Whoever did this hadn't just trespassed on my land, they had violated my family's history. The next morning came crisp and cold, frost painting the meadow silver. Deputy Ward arrived at the barn right on time. I had called him the night before, explaining the situation. To his credit, he agreed to witness whatever we uncovered, even bringing his body camera for evidence. He hesitated with the bolt cutters in hand, glancing at me. "You sure you want to see what's behind this, Grant? Once we open it, you can't unknow it." I nodded, even though part of me already felt like a stranger on my own land. The lock snapped with a sharp crack, clattering to the ground. I pulled the door open, hinges groaning from years of neglect. Inside, the sight made both of us freeze. A zero-turn mower crouched in the shadows, stenciled in bold black paint, Ridgeview Ho. Around it sat plastic-wrapped traffic cones and other equipment that had no business being in my barn. Ward let out a low whistle and immediately began filming, zooming in on the home markings with his phone and his body cam. "Well, this is interesting. Definitely not what I expected to find on private property." He pulled evidence bags from his belt, his movements sharp and practiced. "You mind if I collect some of this, especially that SD card from their trail camera?" I followed his gaze and saw it. A small camera rigged on a tripod, lens pointed through a crack in the barn wall directly at my cabin. That hit me harder than anything else. Ward carefully sealed the SD card into an evidence bag, marking it with his name, date, and time to make the chain of custody airtight. "This goes straight to the evidence locker. I'll file a report for unauthorized use of your property. If you pursue legal action, this will back you up." After Ward left with his evidence bags and a promise to have the report on file by noon, I made another call, this time to Claire Morton, a paralegal out of Bozeman who also did GIS mapping work. Frank Dalton had recommended her after his own property battle years ago. Claire had a reputation for whispering to maps like they were old friends, uncovering secrets others overlooked. When she showed up that afternoon, she carried a laptop and a banker's box full of weathered documents that looked older than either of us. She spread them across my kitchen table with the precision of a card dealer. "Grant, you'd better sit down," she said, pulling up digital overlays, "because this isn't just about your cabin or the barn full of home equipment. This is much bigger." At first, I thought I'd wasted my money that she'd show me standard property lines and nothing more. But then she tapped her screen, highlighting a clause buried deep in the original deed. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "This sentence right here," she said, "is your nuclear option against the HOA or anyone who thinks they can push you around." The original deed, dated 1947, made it crystal clear. The Bennett family trust owned not just the cabin lot, but 4 adjoining parcels labeled A through D. Claire flipped through the GIS layers until the screen displayed a perfect 40-acre square stretching from ridge to ridge, every inch of the valley floor. Then she smiled, sharp as a blade. "Here's the kicker. Parcel D contains the only access road in or out of this valley, which means every resident here has to cross your property just to get home." The strip of red she highlighted on the map looked like a noose they'd tied around their own necks. I stared at it in disbelief. She pulled out the original easement, yellowed but still legally binding, stamped by the recorder's office. "See this clause?" she asked, pointing with her pen. "The road easement is non-transferable without the property owner's written consent." Recorded 1947. "It's right here in the county database." She switched over to the digital records to show me the same clause highlighted. "Your grandfather granted people access, sure, yeah, but that permission didn't transfer to any homeowners association, ever." The pieces started falling into place in my mind, like tumblers clicking inside a lock. When Ridgeview Ho formed 5 years ago, they simply declared the road theirs. listing it as community-maintained infrastructure in their paperwork. But in reality, every trip they'd made in or out of the valley for 5 years had been trespassing. Thousands of individual violations. Later that day, Frank Dalton stopped by with coffee. He'd lived in the valley 30 years, and his voice carried the weight of memory. "Your grandfather was too generous, Grant. Let everyone use that road for free, paid for repairs himself, never asked for a dime." He shook his head. When the HOA formed, Veronica just assumed the road came with the properties, never checked the paperwork, never asked permission. She just took it. Frank signed the affidavit Claire had prepared, swearing under oath that the HOA had been using the road without any agreement or payment for 5 years. By evening, my phone buzzed non-stop with neighbors forwarding Veronica's latest community bulletin. She had emailed the entire valley about my violations. Brian Foster, who lived 2 lots over, forwarded it to me with a note, "You need to see this." He'd even highlighted something odd in the metadata as something that would matter later. The bulletin itself was wild. Veronica had called my cabin an eyesore in writing, threatened daily fines of $500 until I installed screening or tore the structure down. She even attached a telephoto of my cabin, red arrows pointing out violations like unpainted wood and original design details. That night, after absorbing everything Claire had shown me, I went to close my bedroom curtains. That's when I froze. Mounted on a tree about 50 feet from my window was a game camera, its lens aimed directly at my bedroom, not at the road or any scenic area. I stepped back from the glass, my skin crawling. This wasn't about enforcing community rules anymore. Someone had been watching me in my own home. That wasn't compliance, it was a warning. I wasn't sure if the camera outside was meant for me, or if someone deeper in the woods was watching. The next morning, Brian Foster knocked on my door. He didn't bother with a greeting and just clutched his phone tight, glancing nervously over his shoulder before stepping inside. "Grant, you need to see this before it disappears," he said, shutting the door behind him. On his phone was an email chain forwarded from Veronica's official HOA account. The thread went back 3 weeks before my confrontation with her. Brian explained that his wife, who did part-time admin work for the HOA, had accidentally been copied on the internal messages. The email headers were legitimate verified domain certificates, everything traced back to their official server. It began with routine discussions about community standards but quickly shifted into something darker, more like a plan to commit fraud than neighborhood management. The attachment that froze my blood was a PDF of my property boundaries, but the markers had been digitally altered, shifted about 30 feet to make it look like my cabin was in violation. The document was dated 2 weeks before they ever confronted me. Brian scrolled to the signature section. 3 board members had already signed off on the falsified boundaries, complete with digital timestamps. "They planned this whole thing in advance," Brian said. "They knew exactly what they were going to claim before they even showed up at your door." Then he pressed play on an audio file embedded in one of the replies. Veronica's voice filled the room, sharp and calculating. "We bury him in legal fees until he caves and sells for whatever we offer," she said with chilling confidence. "I've done this before in Colorado with inherited land. Mountain people always fold when they see the litigation bill, so they can't afford to fight." I squeezed the ceramic mug in my hand so hard it creaked. Her laughter echoed through the recording, joined by chuckles from other board members. One voice, hesitant and faint, muttered, "This seems risky, Veronica." Cracks in their unity. Another attachment revealed something worse, a petition with multiple homeowner signatures against my cabin. But Brian recognized some immediately. "That's supposed to be Tom Chen's," he said. "But Tom's been in Japan for months, so he's posted pictures online the whole time. And this one, Sarah Williams, she told me herself yesterday that she never signed anything against you. Ghost signatures, forged approvals, fraud, plain and simple." I saved every file to encrypted cloud drives while Brian hovered nervously, watching me back up everything to 3 separate services with unique passwords. "You need to be careful," I told him. "If they realize you've got this, they'll try to come after you for violating some fake confidentiality clause or accuse you of stealing their records." Brian nodded grimly. His wife was already looking for another job as she couldn't tolerate the toxic environment anymore. That afternoon, I drove to the eastern boundary of my land. What I found tied everything together. Orange traffic cones lined the roadside, with a freshly posted notice about a safety widening project scheduled for next week. The permits looked official, but what caught my attention were my red survey stakes, set just last month, now sitting inside their so-called work zone targets waiting to be destroyed. The schedule listed heavy equipment arriving Monday morning, long before most people would be awake to notice. I photographed everything from multiple angle semi-legal markers and their fake construction zone overlapping. Then I called Lydia Moore, a GIS analyst Claire had recommended. Lydia was an expert witness in boundary disputes and had exposed falsified surveys in court before. She arrived in her van, parked half off the road, muttering coordinates under her breath. She brushed off my attempt at a handshake, saying, "Physical contact might interfere with the data." Within 2 hours she had hauled out equipment that looked like it belonged on a sci-fi SATA GPS units and laser tools capable of measurements accurate to the centimeter. "Let me show you something that'll blow your mind," Lydia said after just 15 minutes of analysis. Her equipment had mapped every inch of the property, and what appeared on her screen didn't match the HOA's version of reality. She toggled between the official county GIS layers and the maps the HOA had been circulating. Instantly, the altered boundaries lit up in red, like alarm signals. Someone with administrator access had been making gradual edits over the last 6 weeks, slowly shifting property lines in small increments, likely hoping no one would notice subtle changes versus one drastic move. The visual evidence was devastating. The original markers compared against the falsified ones told the entire story in a single, undeniable image, something any jury could easily grasp. Lydia even created a time-lapse animation showing each boundary change, timestamped and linked to specific user logins from the HOA system. "This is amateur work," she said, encrypting and exporting the files. They knew just enough about GIS to fool a casual observer, but they didn't expect anyone to trace the digital footprints. The metadata confirmed it. Every suspicious edit came from the user ID Vernon_H, which matched perfectly to Vernon Hale. The pattern was crystal clear once laid out: an intentional, calculated campaign to steal land through digital trickery instead of honest negotiation. Back at my cabin that evening, I organized everything into folders. The weight of it all pressed down on me. This wasn't just about a power-hungry HOA president anymore. It was organized fraud, deliberate tampering with legal records, a conspiracy to force landowners out by drowning them in legal costs. Veronica's recorded voice echoed in my mind, her smug tone about burying people in fees until they cave. She'd clearly pulled this off before. As I filed the evidence, my phone buzzed. A text from Frank Dalton. "Check your email now." Inside was a public records file he had forwarded. It showed Veronica had used this exact scheme 5 years earlier in Durango. The so-called road widening project wasn't about safety at all. They were erasing my legacy inch by inch through stolen boundaries. By Monday, I was ready. Standing before the entrance, I drove a post into the ground and hammered up a new sign. The sound rang like a warning bell, echoing change that was long overdue. Private road, a 48-hour grace period before access restrictions. The bold black letters on the white metal plate stood like a shield. Claire and I had spent Sunday drafting the notice so it would hold up legally while still offering fairness. Any neighbor could receive a free temporary pass simply by acknowledging the road's private status. The goal wasn't to punish neighbors who had done nothing wrong, only to establish clear ownership before Veronica could twist the law with claims of prescriptive use or adverse possession. By noon, I had set up a folding table at the road's entrance with stacks of temporary passes numbered, dated, and valid for 30 days with basic security features. Families stopped by one after another, some confused, but most cooperative once I explained the truth. Each signed a simple acknowledgement that the road was private property of the Bennett Family Trust. "I had no idea this wasn't HOA property," said Jennifer Martinez, peering through her glasses as she read the single-page document carefully. "Veronica told us when we bought our place 3 years ago that the HOA maintained everything from the highway to our driveways. We've been paying dues for that all along." Her words stung. Then she admitted something even heavier. She had once questioned the HOA about road maintenance fees, only to be silenced with threats of fines. That same story repeated half a dozen more times before lunch. Each family believed they had been paying for legitimate HOA-controlled infrastructure. Each one realized they had been misled. Tom Rodriguez and his family were especially gracious, apologizing for the misunderstanding. When I showed them the original easement from my grandfather's time, they nodded in understanding. My grandfather would have wanted everyone to have access, I told them as I printed their pass on my portable machine. He was a good neighbor, but he also would have demanded respect for property rights, and he certainly wouldn't have stood by while someone tried to steal his land through fraud and intimidation. By mid-afternoon, I had issued 14 passes. Neighbors left not resentful, but relieved and grateful this wouldn't become a destructive war that would poison the entire community for years. The 15th vehicle to approach was Veronica's white Lexus, and she didn't slow down. But I caught her eyes in the rearview mirror. There wasn't fear there, only pure fury burning like a warning. Within 2 hours, I received a call from someone claiming to be from code enforcement, saying they'd gotten complaints about illegal traffic restrictions on a public thoroughfare that supposedly violated state law and federal commerce regulations. "Sir, I need you to check your records again, because someone has given you false information," I replied calmly, already expecting this move straight out of Veronica's intimidation playbook. "What's your badge number and callback extension so I can verify this is a legitimate county CALA and not someone impersonating an official, which would be a federal crime?" The caller hesitated, then hung up immediately without offering a single credential, confirming my suspicion that this was either Veronica herself or someone she'd recruited to harass me with fake authority. The next morning brought the escalation I'd hoped to avoid, a county attorney clerk calling about a request for a temporary restraining order based on prescriptive use claims. The HOA is claiming 5 years of uninterrupted use, establishing public access rights through continuous possession, the clerk explained, her voice flat, like she was reading directly from notes someone had written for her. "They're seeking an emergency injunction to prevent you from restricting access while the matter is adjudicated, claiming immediate and irreparable harm to property values and emergency service access." I gave her Claire's contact information, and within an hour, Claire had already filed our counter motion, backed by Frank's sworn affidavit about the true history and a detailed maintenance ledger showing years of costs. That afternoon, the fire marshal's inspection turned into an unexpected advantage. Inspector Bill Harper walked the land with me, pointing out vulnerabilities hidden under the HOA's false claims of ownership. "Mr. Bennett, without legal access, this road is a fuse and one spark means no one gets out safely during a wildfire evacuation," he said, scribbling notes on his tablet. "If this road isn't publicly maintained, and the HOA doesn't have a valid easement, we'll need to update emergency response protocols immediately to reflect the real ownership situation." He explained that if the HOA was falsely claiming ownership without documentation, it could affect mutual aid agreements and invalidate insurance liability for every house in the valley. In fact, every homeowner's insurance policy might already be void, since no legal access meant their mortgages could be called in overnight, bankrupting anyone who couldn't pay them off. He promised to file his own report with the county, forcing an official determination rather than leaving Veronica to wage war with complaints and petitions. That evening Claire called with the first real victory. "The county attorney's office has declined to pursue the TRO," she said, her voice carrying triumph even through the phone. They cited the maintenance records and the 1947 easement language as determinative. Continuous private ownership, no abandonment, no dedication to public use. The prescriptive use claim is dead. I finally smiled for the first time in days. Veronica would have to find another angle or finally admit defeat. By Thursday morning, the gate went up, nothing aggressive or fortress-like, just a clean automated gate with keypad and camera, designed for documentation and convenience. A private road sign stood beside it in bold reflective lettering, with emergency vehicle exemptions clearly displayed. The system was programmed with codes for everyone who received temporary passes, easy enough for residents, impossible to ignore for the HOA. While finishing the setup, the contractor, an older man who'd seen his share of land disputes, nodded toward skid marks on the asphalt. "You might want to add speed bumps or some traffic calming down the line. People have been treating this stretch like a racetrack. That kind of wear adds up quick if you're footing the bill for maintenance yourself. Later that evening, Inspector Harper followed up with an email, his fire code analysis attached in detail, a further proof that Veronica's empire of intimidation was beginning to crumble. The implications of the whole lacking proper easement documents were staggering, and Harper's conclusion made me whistle under my breath. Every single insurance policy in the valley could be voided without valid access rights, which meant mortgages could be called in at once, bankrupting any homeowner who couldn't pay off their loan immediately. When I reviewed Harper's file outlining the catastrophic fallout for the HOA's insurance standing, I couldn't decide if I was holding leverage that might end this quietly, or a weapon that could ignite an all-out war. The gate had been the first battle. What came next could unfold in a courtroom, or worse, on my own doorstep. Inspector Diane Harper arrived the following morning with a team of 3 investigators. Their white van pulled up just as the sun cleared the ridge, painting everything in golden light. She stepped out, clipboard in hand and a hard hat on her head. Her serious expression left no doubt that this wasn't for show. "Mr. Bennett, based on the preliminary findings and Fire Marshal Harper's earlier report, we need to conduct a full inspection of unauthorized modifications on your property," she announced. Her voice carried the gravity of someone who had seen far too many land crimes disguised as improvements. My stomach twisted as her flashlight beam swept across fresh scarring in the earth. Her team moved with clinical precision of measuring tapes, cameras, devices that beeped when they hit buried utilities, documenting everything like seasoned crime scene investigators. Within an hour, Harper was shaking her head in disbelief at the sheer audacity of what they found. "They've trenched through here for utility lines without permits or notice," she pointed out, indicating raw soil someone had tried to disguise with a thin cover. "And those trees they cleared along your eastern boundary? That's timber theft, judging by the ring counts. Some of these pines were more than 80 years old." My grandfather's words echoed in my mind: never let the land be carved without consent. Seeing those stumps felt like watching his wisdom reduced to sawdust. Harper pulled out her tablet, comparing aerial survey photos from last year to the present, and the difference was jaw-dropping. Roadway expansions, encroachments, unauthorized clearings, all of it stacked up like evidence in a trial. She showed me a map overlay where 15 feet stolen on paper translated to a brutal reality. My property's eastern edge shaved away, my grandfather's hand-dug drainage ditches paved over as if they'd never mattered. "This isn't just encroachment," Harper explained, tapping on her tablet as her team recorded every violation with laser measurements and photographic evidence. "This is deliberate infrastructure theft, worth about $200,000 in improvements they made on your land without permission." She broke down the damages into categories for her report: $120,000 for infrastructure, $50,000 for environmental destruction, and another $30,000 for restoration. Just then Claire called, her voice controlled but brimming with the thrill of discovery. "Grant, I found something in the archives that Veronica has no idea about." Papers rustled in the background as she explained. "The deed includes a non-transferable easement clause, the one I mentioned before, but here's the catch. It requires written consent from the property owner for any transfer of access rights, not just for the HOA, but for every single property." The chain of custody was airtight, filed in 1947, referenced in every subsequent deed, but apparently never studied properly. Veronica had been selling homes on promises of access she had no legal power to grant. The weight of Claire's words sank in. "I didn't just own land, I owned leverage." And their arrogance had blinded them from seeing the truth right in their own paperwork. This wasn't just about the HOA anymore, it was about every property deed in the valley carrying a fatal flaw that could unravel millions in transactions. Later that week, Veronica herself showed up at my cabin. No board members, no witnesses, just her Lexus in the driveway and an envelope clutched in her hand. She walked up to my porch, her face fighting to hold confidence, though her fingers trembled. "Mr. Bennett," she began, forcing a brittle smile that looked more like pain, "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. I'd like to resolve this matter privately, without lawyers or unnecessary conflict in the community." She held out the envelope. Even before I took it, I could see the edges of cash pressed against the paper. The envelope flap was slightly open, and inside sat a thick stack of $100 bills of Veronica's first attempt at bribery. I'd already prepared for this possibility with Deputy Ward, who had armed me with a vial of UV powder. The moment I touched the cash, the powder spread invisibly, coating both the money and anyone who handled it, leaving behind undeniable evidence. Part of me wanted to throw the envelope back at her, to end it right there. But the wiser part of me knew the only way forward was to let her trap herself. I took the bundle carefully, flipping through it while the powder did its quiet work. "This is $20,000 in cash," Veronica whispered, her voice so low it was as though she feared the trees themselves might be listening. "All I need is your signature on a simple easement agreement, is something to keep the status quo and end these inspections." The desperation in her tone told me she already knew the walls were closing in around her. She wasn't just bargaining, she was begging. I kept my face unreadable, thumbs brushing over the tainted bills, while I discreetly texted Ward under the table. Then I let out a slow sigh, shaking my head as though I was genuinely torn. "I'll think about it," I said at last, slipping the envelope aside. "But I'll keep the money while I decide." Her shoulders eased ever so slightly, mistaking my words for progress. Within minutes of her leaving, Ward pulled up, bringing a portable UV lamp. The bills lit up with a violent glow, and so did Veronica's fingertips. It was like her guilt had written itself in light evidence she could never scrub away. "That's attempted bribery of a property owner in connection to a legal matter," Ward said with grim satisfaction as he sealed the bills into an evidence bag. By the next morning, the county district attorney's office had called. They were opening a formal investigation into civil and consumer fraud charges against the HOA board. Criminal charges weren't yet on the table, but the DA's assistant made it clear the evidence revealed a pattern of deception that violated state consumer protection laws. The Attorney General's office was watching closely, ready to step in if interstate issues arose. The pressure built quickly. That same afternoon, a contractor who had worked for the HOA came forward with records. His invoices, emails, and screenshots of text messages told a damning story. Veronica had personally directed him to move survey stakes and had shown him doctored maps as proof the land was theirs. GPS coordinates and his testimony locked her lies into place. Combined with Harper's inspection report, the picture was undeniable. Years of calculated theft, dressed up as community improvements. I spent the evening sorting through it all, organizing documents, labeling folders by category, stacking every piece of proof into a weapon I could wield at the right moment. Veronica's recorded voice still echoed in my head, that smug threat about burying opponents in legal fees. She had pulled this before, and she believed she would again. But then Frank Dalton's message arrived. Attached were public records from Colorado, showing Veronica had run this exact scheme in Durango 5 years earlier. Fraud, altered surveys, legal intimidation of the same playbook. She had simply relocated and started again. Even with the ground shifting beneath her and her empire cracking apart, I knew one thing for certain: Veronica wasn't finished yet. By Saturday evening, the community hall was overflowing. Cars lined the road all the way to the gate. Neighbors crammed shoulder to shoulder in tense silence. The coffee and donuts set out on the side table went untouched, the weight of anticipation killing every appetite in the room. I'd arrived early with my evidence boards, 3 simple poster displays instead of a fancy slideshow. No one needed technical jargon, they needed the truth clear enough to strike like a hammer. When the crowd finally settled, I rose and carried my boards to the front. Conversations died into silence, and every eye followed me to the podium. Veronica sat rigid at the board's table with her last 2 allies, her smile brittle under the rumors of investigations swirling through the valley. "What you're about to see," I began, my voice steady, "is proof of systematic fraud, a fraud that places every one of your homes at risk. You need to understand exactly what's been done to all of us." I lifted the first board, revealing the GIS overlay, original property lines in green, and the altered HOA version in red. The manipulation was obvious to anyone with eyes. The red lines of anadrama-nest manipulation cut across the map like wounds, showing exactly where they'd stolen from me and put everyone's property at risk legally through deliberate falsification of documents. One woman gasped audibly when she saw how close the alterations came to her own property line, and another cursed under her breath. finally understanding the danger they had all been in. The second board showed the insurance underwriter's letter displayed in enlarged text for everyone to read, clearly stating in unambiguous terms that without valid legal access, coverage could be voided immediately. Claire had obtained this letter from the largest insurer in the valley, and it applied to every policy they held, which was most of the neighborhood, including people who'd lived here for decades. Your mortgages could be called in tomorrow if your insurance lapses, I explained, letting the weight of that information sink in as people pulled out phones to photograph the board for their records. Every single one of you is at risk right now because of fraudulent claims about road ownership that were never true and can't be made true retroactively, no matter what the Anadroma Nest claims. The murmuring that started was worried rather than angry, people suddenly realizing their biggest investment might evaporate overnight because of Veronica's schemes and lies built over years. The third board contained the custody log for all evidence, E. Ward's signature, Harper's stamp, and the county DA's file number in bold printed. It meant this was officially a criminal matter now. Everything has been documented by law enforcement and is part of an active investigation that will likely result in criminal charges, I said, making eye contact with as many neighbors as possible to convey the seriousness. The fraud is real, the evidence is overwhelming, and the consequences are coming whether you sign tonight's agreement or not. But signing protects you from the fallout. The room erupted in angry voices directed at Veronica, who stood up so fast her chair fell backward with a crash that echoed through the hall like a gunshot announcing war. These are fabrications designed to destroy our community values that we've worked years to build, Veronica shouted, her face flushed red with rage and desperation. You're all sheep being led to slaughter, she screamed, completely losing her composure in front of everyone who'd trusted her with their community leadership and their financial futures for years without question. You'd let him burn this community down just to prove a point about some ancient property lines that should have been changed years ago. Chairs scraped as people physically leaned away from her outburst. The board members beside her actually moved their chairs to create distance from someone clearly spiraling out of control. The panic in her voice when she tried to answer questions about mortgages and insurance only made things worse. Her carefully constructed authority was crumbling in real time as neighbors shouted questions. That's when the man who'd leaked the emails stood up from the back row, holding up his phone with the audio file ready to play for everyone to hear the truth. I think everyone needs to hear what Veronica really thinks about burying people in legal fees until they lose everything, he said, hitting play before anyone could stop him. Veronica's recorded voice filled the room, talking about crushing me with litigation costs and how mountain people always fold. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Several board members physically moved their chairs away from Veronica, distancing themselves from someone they suddenly realized might drag them down into criminal charges and financial ruin. Claire stood to explain the memorandum of understanding that would resolve everything cleanly without destroying anyone's life unnecessarily, keeping her explanation brief but clear. $30 per household per month for legal road access guaranteed in perpetuity for you and your heirs, with a restoration bond to fix the damage already done to Mr. Bennett's property. Sign tonight and everything stays stable with your homes protected legally, Claire continued, passing out copies efficiently. So many hands reached for salvation from this mess. Don't sign and you're gambling with your property's future in ways that could cost you everything you've worked for in this valley. $30 a month is cheaper than losing your home to a voided mortgage, and everyone in this room can do that math. Tom Chen, always quiet at these meetings, signed first, muttering, "Let's stop the bleeding before it gets worse." His pen moved across the paper with decisive strokes. Within an hour, 87% of the homeowners had signed the agreement, including 2 of Veronica's board members who publicly resigned their positions while signing the documents. The holdouts were mostly Veronica's inner circle, but even they looked uncertain as they watched their neighbors choosing security over loyalty to a leader who'd betrayed them all with lies. Someone asked about the criminal investigation and what it meant for board members, and I confirmed the DA was moving forward with charges. Fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Those were the charges hanging in the air like a storm about to break. I reminded everyone in the room that anyone who had been involved in fabricating documents or forging signatures should speak with their own lawyer before the investigation widened any further. Several faces blanched instantly, their guilt written plainly across them. The breaking point came when someone bluntly asked Veronica if she had pulled the same tricks on a family in Colorado, weaponizing endless legal battles to strip them of their land. That question shattered her composure. Her fury erupted in violence as she shoved the man who had leaked her emails, sending him stumbling into a table, knocking over cups and papers in a clattering mess. Chaos filled the room. Phones were raised instantly, recording her assault from multiple angles, sealing her fate on video. Ward, who had been quietly watching from the back, stepped forward with unshakable authority. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault," he declared, pulling out handcuffs as he recited her rights. The room fell silent, stunned by the spectacle of their longtime leader being cuffed and dragged out while cursing everyone who dared defy her. That image of Veronica being taken away in disgrace would echo through the valley for years. After her arrest, the remaining board members, stripped of their arrogance, turned to me with desperate faces. They asked if I could show some leniency on the restoration costs, given the HOA's strained budget and their willingness to cooperate moving forward. $120,000, I replied firmly but without cruelty. That covers the inspector's documented damages. You can pay in installments with fair interest, but work starts within 30 days. If not, I'll handle it myself and place a lien against HOA assets to recover costs. The pens moved quickly across the paperwork, signatures piling up one after another. Order slowly returned to the chaos, though I noticed a figure slipping quietly out the back door, phone still in hand, clearly not done stirring trouble. By Monday morning, Claire and I were at the county recorder's office, finalizing the permanent easement agreement that would secure road access for generations. When the clerk's seal pressed into the paper, I felt a weight lift from my chest, like I had been holding my breath for weeks without realizing it. The agreement was straightforward yet powerful: perpetual access guaranteed for $30 per household per month, adjusted annually for inflation with transparent accounting. My grandfather had always said, "Ink on land is louder than any shout," and that day, it roared like thunder through the valley. Emergency vehicles were given unquestioned priority. Signage was minimal but clear. Any future amendments required approval from 75% of all property owners. "This protects every NIA, even future owners," Claire said as the document was stamped official. "No one will have to endure another Veronica situation again." That same afternoon, the court issued a 3-year no-contact order, forbidding Veronica from coming within 500 feet of any Bennett family trust land. On top of that, her assets were frozen pending both civil and criminal trials, preventing her from cashing out and fleeing like she had in Colorado. The HOA, now under emergency leadership by newly elected volunteers, voted to secure a $120,000 restoration bond immediately. Her financial empire built on fear, deceit, and intimidation was collapsing with breathtaking speed. Then came the civil penalty. The board levied a $90,000 judgment against Veronica for breach of fiduciary duty after forensic accounting revealed she had siphoned HOA funds for her personal benefit, paying for contractors on her own property while billing the association. Her nameplate was stripped from the community center. Her white Lexus vanished from the neighborhood. Even her name was scraped off the mailbox. By Wednesday, criminal charges were officially filed of fraud, forgery, and assault, with sentencing possibilities reaching up to 12 years. Her husband was named a co-conspirator, their real estate license suspended by the state board. To make matters worse, the family she had wronged in Colorado had also filed lawsuits, adding to the avalanche of legal ruin. By Friday, restoration crews were already at work on my land. They tore out the illegal pavement and restored the natural drainage my grandfather had designed decades ago. The scent of cedar from newly planted saplings filled the air, taking me back to childhood mornings walking the property line with him, checking for storm damage. The mature trees would take decades to return, but the HOA's insurance was set to cover replanting and long-term care until the new ones grew strong. Unauthorized utility lines were finally legitimized with proper easements, ensuring I received compensation for their use of my land. Watching the soil turn back to what it was meant to be felt like justice taking physical form. Every shovel of earth was a small victory, a piece of stolen dignity restored. Neighbors began approaching me, their voices low with apologies. Some were sincere, some nervous, but all carried the weight of regret. Over the following weeks, the apologies came in many forms, some spoken, some written, and a few tucked alongside small gestures like jars of preserves or freshly baked bread. A teenage girl who had once thrown eggs at my cabin slipped me a hand-drawn note that read, "Sorry, I didn't know." Again and again, I heard the same regret, that they should have spoken up, should have questioned Veronica's authority, should have been better neighbors. One man, who had been abroad during the worst of the ordeal, apologized personally for his forged signature being used against me. Another arrived with her famous apple pie, admitting she'd stayed quiet only out of fear that she'd become Veronica's next target if she defended me publicly. For the first time in years, it felt like we weren't just neighbors bound by an HOA but something closer to a real community. The local news picked up the story, running a feature on HOA overreach that used our valley as a stark warning. The cameras lingered on my weathered porch swing, rocking and the breeze is still standing strong despite every attempt to force its removal. Several residents admitted on camera that they had never truly read their HOA agreements or challenged the board's claims about property lines until it was too late. The segment closed with a shot of my cabin, unchanged after 60 years, while the reporter remarked that sometimes preserving history requires standing your ground. At the very next county commissioner meeting, a new grassroots measure was passed demanding that all HOAs submit annual property boundary reports verified against county records. Locals quickly nicknamed it the Bennett Rule. It also required that board meetings be recorded and that all non-confidential HOA documents remain open to public access permanently. It wasn't revenge, it was protection, written into policy to prevent future abuse. Soon, neighboring counties began considering similar measures, turning our valley's struggle into the spark of wider reform. Even the law firm that had represented Veronica wasn't spared. The state bar issued them a formal order to undergo mandatory ethics training after their role in filing documents with falsified boundaries crossed ethical line, as ignorance was no excuse. That summer, the valley hosted its long-delayed BBQ on a flawless July evening. The barn doors stood open, strings of lights glowing between the rafters my grandfather had raised decades ago. In the same meadow where I had once been ambushed, laughter echoed as children played and neighbors gathered over grilled food and cold drinks. Those who had once stood silent during the conflict now came with their families, their dishes, their laughter. The valley, for the first time in years, felt whole. As the sun dipped behind the western ridge, painting the valley in gold, Frank pulled me aside. "Your grandfather would be proud of how you handled this," he said softly, lifting his bottle in a quiet toast. I raised mine to meet his. In that moment, I could almost feel my grandfather smiling, watching over the land and the people who had finally come together to protect it. He always said this land would take care of the family who took care of it. Standing here now, I realized he had been right all along. Maybe this was never about winning a fight or crushing an enemy. Maybe it was about proving that we could live here as neighbors without an HOA's manufactured drama, without bylaws used like weapons, without false authority dictating every blade of grass. The valley had found its balance again. But on quiet nights, I still catch myself listening a little too closely, half expecting someone to try again. And maybe that's the real truth. Peace isn't granted by laws or policies. It's built by people who refuse to be pushed out. If you're still with me, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if the story resonated with you, the little thanks button is right below. Stay sharp, stay grounded. That's a wrap from Anna Drama Nesta, but don't go anywhere. There's plenty more drama, twists, and unbelievable stories waiting just around the corner.